I guess, fitting in a way that this is happening on the eve of Yom Kippur. My enormous thanks to Whitney Harris and John Haley, Linda McLean, and Layla Sadat Laimeh for reacting at the very last minute once they heard about me and my connection to this film, for inviting me spontaneously to come. It, I must say, gives, I think, the lie to any notion that the law and lawyers are ponderous people. This is I'd like to try to tell you a very long and complex story in a very few minutes. And so I hope you'll forgive me if I end up kind of racing through what I think is actually a fascinating story that hasn't really been covered in the last 2 days. Although the images, there's been talk of the legacy of Nuremberg, but in fact one of the most enduring legacies of Nuremberg are precisely the images that you've just seen. Though ironically in the Russian version rather than the American version, which I'm here to introduce. I wonder how many of you have seen the film that we're going to see, Nuremberg, its lesson for today. Can I see a quick show of hands? Well, it's not so surprising because, as I will explain, the film, although it was made by the War Department at the behest of Jackson and the other people involved with the trial, it was subsequently quashed by the War Department and has yet to be seen in this country. It was preempted by the Russians, who made this also quite effective film, which I've never seen in its entirety, so I'm very grateful that you showed it today. I'd seen clips of it in Russian only. In any case, I'm going to try to take you behind the scenes and tell you a little bit about this, the evolution of this film. And the story has 3 parts. Part 1 is the search for the film that was presented at the trial as evidence. Part 2 is the struggle to make the film about Nuremberg, the film we're going to see. And part 3 is, which will be even briefer, the story, as little as we know at least, of the suppression of the film. Excuse me here, getting way ahead of myself. As you may know, Jackson and William Donovan, the head of the OSS, had decided prior to the trial that they wanted to use film at the trial. And Donovan decided to pull together a team of OSS men who were drawn from all of the services, and they included my uncle Bud Schulberg, who was a Navy lieutenant, my father Stuart Schulberg, who was a young Marine, a 22-year-old Marine, and the only Marine in the unit. And they were put under the command of John Ford, the movie director, the Hollywood director, who was a Navy captain. And there are some funny stories about Bud and Ford, because of course Ford and the Schulbergs knew each other going back to Hollywood days. My grandfather had been head of production at Paramount, and so there was a close family connection there. But we don't have time, I'm afraid, for those stories. So in the spring of 1945, they organized this unit, and it included, besides Bud and Stuart Schulberg, Commander Ray Kellogg, who was really Ford's number 2, and ended up being the operational head of the unit. And a couple of film editors, Joe Ziegman, who subsequently became the editor of the film we're going to see, Nuremberg, and Bob Parrish, who became a famous film editor, subsequently, of Hollywood movies. And it included some very prominent German prisoner informants, including Heinrich Hoffmann, who had been Hitler's personal photographer, and 2 Nazi film editors, Walter Rode and Kurt von Moldow. According to Bud, they each accused the other of being a Nazi, and both claimed that they had not been true Nazis. And then, of course, Leni Riefenstahl, who my uncle Bud personally arrested, tracked down and arrested at her home on the Schulberg and drove to Nuremberg so that she could serve as a material witness in their cutting room, helping them to identify the names and faces of the people they were seeing on film. Now, according to Baden, I want to refer you to this really extraordinary article that he wrote that there's a copy of outside in 1946. It's the only time he's ever written about this, although he and I are now working on a book. He's 93 and trying to keep pace with Whitney here. It describes the process of hunting for the film in eloquent detail. Although we are discovering now, having just found my father's letters from 1945, that there are some errors that he, in his recollection, and we'll be trying to correct those and constitute the clearest historical record we can. There's been very little written about this whole aspect of the hunt for the film and the use of the film at the trial. Although I do want to recommend, if you speak French, this marvelous book that's just appeared called La Vérité par l'Image that came out in February of this year in Paris by Christian Delage, who's probably the foremost French expert on the use of film at the trial. Now I'm going to try to just take you quickly through this process and again urge you to read Bud's piece. My father seems to have been part of the advance guard that went to Europe to procure the film. Meanwhile, the older, more senior members of the team were back in Washington because their first plan, as some of you know, was to constitute a film using available footage in the United States. They were getting regularly the Wochenschau material that Christoph referred to, and they had planned to build this evidentiary film using that. But at the last minute, Jackson informed them that he felt they could not use any footage, even if it was German footage, that had been spirited out and ended up in the United States and had passed through American hands. So he insisted that the unit set up in Europe and procure new original footage that they could unquestionably document and authenticate as having been produced for the Reich, by the Reich, either in Germany or the occupied territories. So this, because at that point they thought the trial was going to begin September 15, put them into a fever of activity. And yet, although there was this tremendous time pressure, my father's letters document that once he got there in late June and arriving first in London, that there was just one snafu after another, that he was being expected to do, as he describes it, an officer's job with only 2 stripes. He was a lowly sergeant. That the majors, and he refers to Patterson and Hamilton in particular, didn't know what they were doing and were preventing him from doing his job. And he's really terribly depressed because the time is just flying by and he has no authority to commandeer trucks or planes or get out in the field and start looking for this footage. So a month later, he's finally able to commandeer transport, and he locates a cache of SS film in Bayreuth. And he describes his sense of satisfaction as he watches the SS officers who were forced to load the film cans into the trucks under armed guard. Although he remarks that he's also troubled by this subjugation, but then he reminds himself what they've been guilty of, and he feels a sense of satisfaction. The same day, ironically, after watching the SS officers load the film, he flies the material to London, which was at that point still the headquarters for this film procurement and editing process. And although he's cabled ahead, there's no one there to meet the plane. He waits hours and hours. Finally, the phone connections are impossible. He finally gets to OSS headquarters, and around nightfall, a truck finally arrives, but no one to help unload. So he and the truck driver spend hours, everyone's left the airfield, they spend hours unloading these crates and crates and crates of film that he's found. Now, A week later, he's writing that he hopes that Kellogg, who, as I say, was effectively the chief of the unit, he's heard that Kellogg has arrived in London, and he's desperately hoping, as he says, that Kellogg will, quote, clean up the mess. He hears that Bud is on the way with 2 cutters, and meanwhile he says he's found some pretty good film, which eases my conscience, he says, because he's feeling so bad that he's on this sort of joyride. I mean, it's fascinating to be in Europe, and yet he feels terribly guilty that they're not really out there getting the film that Jackson and his team have requested. On August 7th, he hears that there are 35 people finally on their way from Washington, and that Bud will be the officer in charge of film procurement, and he's supposedly going to be the procurement writer, and he wonders what that means. Finally, on August 27th, Bud arrives and is able to cut through substantially the red tape, and but it's not until the editors, however, don't arrive till September 12, and Stuart, my father, is bemoaning the fact that they've already lost 3 months. But a couple of days later, they learn that Donovan has arranged for them to have their own plane so that they can shuttle from London, Paris, Berlin, Nuremberg, and other cities. And on September 24, Stuart actually is relocated to Nuremberg, which will then be the base of operations in terms of communicating with prosecutors. But when he gets there, he's told that Jackson is absolutely livid because Bud has disappeared in the plane, which it turns out was meant to be Jackson's plane and not the plane for the film unit. The next day, he reports that he sees some of the prisoners for the first time out walking in the yard, and he even sneaks a picture of one of them, which is against regulations. And he reports that Goering is being given a daily supply of dope to prevent him from going into withdrawal. On September 28, now things are starting, the tide is starting to turn. He reports that he and Joe Zigman, the cutter, have become the, quote, belles of the courthouse, and that the trial may open with one of their pictures, which was not true, did not turn out to be true. Now, to close this section of the film, I just want to read you from one letter. I've been just sort of madly trying to read through these letters in preparation for coming here. This one is dated November 9. My darling Barbara, my mother, a big event yesterday. Hess was brought to our projection room to see himself and the other top Nazis rant and roar in Triumph of the Will, the Leni Riefenstahl film on the 1934 Nuremberg Party Congress. Colonel Amen, chief prosecutor here, and the psychiatrists who are working with Hess hoped he would give himself away under the shock of seeing himself in action. And you just saw, I think quite effectively in the Russian film, those images. They hoped he would give some clue that his amnesia, which is also referred to in the Russian film, is a fraud by which he hopes to escape any punishment. The experiment was a failure. Hess performed brilliantly, if he is faking, and gave a perfect imitation of a man who has lost his memory. And he goes on to say, the contrast between Hess in person and Hess on the screen was ghastly. He used to be a powerful, virile guy who gave you the feeling, despite your anti-fascism, of great strength. Now he is a bent little man, his hair gone gray, his eyes vacant and hopeless. No matter what he has been, it hurt me. I find it so odd that my father, a Jew, was able to sympathize so with Hess, but here it goes. It hurt me to see a man fall apart so completely. There was something so humiliating about his position. He was a caged curiosity that everyone came to gawk at. I will never grow accustomed to seeing men in the complete control of other men. It turns my stomach. It is rotten. And he goes on to say, I've been busy as hell writing affidavits saying that I hereby certify that the attached pictures have been at all times in my custody and that they are true photographs and that at no time have they been altered, retouched, or tampered in any way. all pictures need some kind of affidavit before they can be introduced as evidence. And since I've been on the longest, my affidavit is being used on almost all still pictures. Thus, your own husband's name will go down in the court transcripts of the most important trial in history. I want you to know that this has not gone to my head, and that my price for a simple handshake remains at the usual 2 marks. Almost every section here is now using at least some photographic evidence. We have succeeded in making stuffy attorneys picture conscious. At first we had to almost sell our pictures. I would acquaint myself with a certain officer's work, select an armful of pictures, and then go up and lecture him on the value of photographic evidence. That was before. By now, word of mouth has traveled into every dim corridor and every dingy office, and now the attorneys are calling on us. Orders for shots range from hard-to-fill pictures of Admiral Raeder giving the Nazi salute to rare shots of the SA drilling with machine guns in 1924. So far, we've been able to fill nearly every order and contribute a lot of other pictures which people never even supposed we'd have. Sometimes I think the job is a few sizes too big for me. I suppose I've never before had so much responsibility. There are times each day when I go off by myself and I just shiver for a few minutes. There's so much to do, and so much of it is so important. Somehow, though, we've muddled through every problem and apparently made a good impression everywhere. Jackson called Donovan this afternoon and asked him to thank and congratulate us on our work. A picture is worth 1,000 words, he cracked. So that is going to bring me to the end of what is a much longer, more complicated account of the search for the footage that was presented at the trial. Now, just so you know, though, the end result of that, and it was really the trial's postponement to November 1 that enabled them to complete their mission on time. They feared, as Bud writes, that they would never have been able to do the job if the trial had not been postponed. And what they ended up creating was 2 major pieces of evidentiary film. The first one was a film that they re-edited that is termed Nazi concentration camps. And it was film that was actually shot by British and U.S. liberators of the camps. That film was shown by Jackson earlier than he'd originally planned. It was shown on November 29th of the trial. And the other film, which was much, much more complicated for them to put together and which no one in America has ever seen, was a 4-hour compilation film entirely in German called The Nazi Plan. And this was the core of the film evidence that they had been asked to prepare, along with, of course, thousands of photographs, which became my father's particular responsibility. Now, we're going to jump to part 2 of the story. Jack, early on, and the Palace of Justice was configured actually by an architect who had, an OSS man who had trained with Eero Saarinen and another famous architect.
A magnificent film. You know, when we drafted the indictment, we charged the Germans with a conspiracy for waging aggressive war and committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we were, the prosecutors, chief prosecutors, delivered their addresses, as you can see, on November 20th, 1945. Those of us who were just trial counsel were busy in our rooms wondering how we were going to get the evidence. You know, in an ordinary trial, you don't indict somebody until you know that the crime has been committed and you have the evidence that the crime was committed and that he participated in some way in committing the crime. We didn't have any evidence at that time. We had accumulated a lot of documents in our document room, but those had to be translated. We didn't have them yet into English, French, and Russian. And we were despairing, most of us, as we sat in our offices trying to figure out how we were going to prove our case. I had to...
Let me just add one more word of thanks while we're talking about film. I want to thank Daryl, our...
I don't have a copy right now.